Hi guys, tonight we step far beyond the reach of written memory, back to a night around 90,000 years ago, when there are no cities glowing on the horizon, no roads crossing the land, and no clocks quietly reminding you that tomorrow has already begun. Above you, the sky is enormous, stars gather in bright, unfamiliar patterns, and the pale edge of the Milky Way stretches from one dark horizon to another. Somewhere nearby, a small fire gives a soft crackle. Smoke carries the dry scent of wood and grass. Cool air settles against your skin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, you can leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and what your local time is right now. It is always strangely comforting to imagine people in different corners of the world sharing the same quiet journey through their past. Now, dim the lights, and let the modern world fall gently behind you. You're standing in a world that is both deeply familiar and almost impossible to recognize. This is Earth during the later part of the Pleistocene, a long period marked by repeated shifts between colder and warmer conditions. Vast ice sheets lie far to the north. But the planet is not simply frozen. Africa contains forests, open grasslands, lakes, dry valleys, coastal plains, and regions where rainfall can change dramatically over generations. The people living here are Homo sapiens, members of your own species. They are not unfinished versions of modern humans. Their bodies are already recognizably like yours. They care for children, make tools, gather food, communicate, remember paths, watch the weather, and probably argue about matters that would seem surprisingly ordinary. Even 90,000 years ago, someone was probably annoyed that another person had misplaced something useful. You begin walking slowly across the ground. The earth feels cool beneath your feet. Dry stems brush against your legs. In the distance, an animal calls once and then falls silent. There are no fences, no lamps, and no straight lines cut deliberately across the landscape. Everything seems softer at the edges. Hills fade into darkness. Trees gather in uneven groups. A faint breeze moves through tall grass with a whisper like fabric being folded. Humanity at this time is scattered across many environments. Groups live near rivers, coasts, inland lakes, wooded uplands, or dry regions where water must be found with care. Their lives are shaped by local conditions, and those conditions do not remain stable forever. Rainfall patterns move, lakes expand and contract, familiar animals change their routes. A valley that once offered dependable water may become harder to cross, while dry land elsewhere may briefly become greener. For people whose survival depends on close knowledge of the landscape, these changes matter enormously. You imagine a small group waking before sunrise. Someone stirs last night's ashes and finds warmth hidden beneath the grey surface. A few glowing coals brighten beneath dry grass and wood. Smoke rises slowly, then bends with the breeze. Fire is already an ancient companion. Humans and earlier human species have used it for a very long time, although archaeologists still debate how consistently controlled fire was used in different places and eras. Here its usefulness feels obvious. It gives warmth, light, protection, and a place to gather. Nearby, stone tools lie beside worked wood and other materials that rarely preserve as well. One mainstream fact about this period is that many African Homo sapiens communities used Middle Stone Age technologies. Stone was shaped into flakes and points through methods requiring skill and practice. To modern eyes, a stone flake looks almost absurdly modest. It does not flash, beep, or demand an update at the least convenient moment. Yet in skilled hands, a sharp edge can cut fibres, prepare food, shape wood, or work hides. The cleverness is not in the object alone. It is in the knowledge behind it, and that knowledge has to move from one person to another. Perhaps you sit near an adult shaping stone while a younger person watches. A hammerstone taps against prepared rock. A flake breaks away with a crisp sound. Dust gathers on the fingers. There is patience here, repetition, and likely teaching through words, gestures, or demonstration. Researchers continue to question exactly when language became as complex as modern speech. Soft tissues and spoken words do not fossilize, so the answer cannot simply be dug from the ground. Still, the social and technological lives of Homo sapiens strongly suggest sophisticated communication long before written language appears. Around the camp, daily life unfolds quietly. Someone checks a carrying container made from hide, fibre, or bark. Someone else watches a child. Few people prepare to travel toward food or water, while others repair tools, process plants, or tend to someone who is tired. A quirky detail of prehistoric archaeology is that some of the most important objects in daily life were probably made from materials that decay. Wooden digging sticks, baskets, cordage, hides, and plant containers may have been everywhere. Yet stone survives so much better that it can make the ancient world look more stony than it really was. So when you picture this camp, do not picture only rocks and spears. Picture fibres twisted between fingers. Picture skins drying in the sun. Picture bundles of plants. Picture children picking up ordinary objects and turning them into games, because some habits need no invention twice. The sun begins to rise. At first, the eastern sky becomes grey. Then a muted band of colour appears above the land. Shadows shorten slowly. You hear birds beginning their morning calls. The fire loses some of its brightness as daylight strengthens, and the chill starts to lift from your hands. Humanity is still small in number compared with the billions alive today. Populations are separated across immense distances, and some groups may rarely, if ever, meet one another. Yet they are connected by something deeper than roads or cities. They carry memories, skills, relationships, and traditions. And this is where the mystery of 90,000 years ago begins to become more interesting. There is no single morning when humanity suddenly changes. No trumpet sounds, no invisible door opens between primitive and modern. Instead, people live, move, adapt, meet, separate, remember, and forget. Some communities flourish for generations. Others disappear or merge with neighbours. Some journeys leave descendants, others leave only a few stone flakes beneath layers of soil. You watch the ancient camp grow brighter beneath the morning sky, and you realise that what happened to humans 90,000 years ago was not one event waiting to be uncovered. It was a world of events, quiet and countless, unfolding one ordinary day at a time. The morning light spreads slowly across the land, and as you leave the small camp behind, the wider shape of Africa begins to unfold around you. It is tempting, from the comfort of the modern world, to imagine a continent as one great stage on which early humans simply moved from south to north. But the Africa of 90,000 years ago is far more complicated than that. It is a vast collection of environments, each changing at its own pace, each offering different opportunities, and each setting its own quiet limits on where people can go. You walk first through the open grassland. The ground is pale and dry beneath the rising sun. Low shrubs hold beads of moisture from the night. In the distance, a herd moves almost silently across the plain, their bodies dark against the gold of the morning. Somewhere beyond them, birds lift from a patch of reeds. You hear wings beating, then fading. A group of people living here must know this landscape in extraordinary detail. They know where water gathers after rain. They know which plants can be eaten, which roots can be dug when the surface looks barren, and which places are best avoided in the hottest part of the day. They recognize animal tracks not as vague marks in dust, but as information. A bent blade of grass, a fresh print, a broken twig, a patch of disturbed earth. The landscape speaks constantly, and survival depends on learning its language. One mainstream fact about prehistoric Africa is that climate shifted repeatedly during the Pleistocene. Wet periods could expand lakes, rivers, and grasslands, while drier periods could fragment habitats and isolate populations. These changes did not happen everywhere at once, and that unevenness matters. You continue walking and the scenery changes. The grass is thin, the soil becomes harder. Ahead, a basin holds the memory of water. Its edges are marked by old sediments, and perhaps thousands of years earlier it had been greener, fuller, noisier with birds and animals. Now the wind moves dust across the surface. For a human group, a change like this is not an abstract climate trend, it is a practical problem. The familiar spring may be weaker this year. A hunting ground may no longer attract the same animals. A route used by grandparents may become less reliable. Slowly, people must adjust. Some travel farther, some shift toward the coast, some follow river systems, some remain where they are and become more skilled at surviving in difficult conditions. You might wonder whether these communities understood that the climate itself was changing. Probably not in the modern scientific sense. There are no graphs, satellites, weather stations, or anxious headlines announcing that rainfall has fallen below a long-term average. But people who spend their entire lives outdoors notice patterns deeply. They remember seasons. They compare years. Older members of a group may recall a lake being larger when they were young, or animals arriving earlier, or a valley staying green longer. Memory becomes part of survival. And because human populations are scattered, environmental changes also affect relationships between groups. When conditions are good, areas that were once difficult to cross may become easier. Grasslands expand, water becomes more available, animals move into new regions, and humans may follow them. When conditions worsen, those same routes can narrow or disappear. This means that prehistoric populations are sometimes connected and sometimes separated, almost like islands appearing and disappearing in a sea that is made not of water, but of climate. Researchers continue to question exactly how often these changing corridors brought distant human groups into contact with one another. Archaeological evidence can show where people were present, and genetics can reveal later patterns of ancestry. But the intimate details of who met whom are much harder to recover. You pause beside a shaded rock outcrop. The stone is cool when you rest your hand against it. The air beneath the shelter smells faintly of dust, dry plants, and old smoke. Perhaps people have stopped here before. Perhaps they have used this place for generations. There might be small flakes of stone on the ground, left from repairing tools. There might be ash buried beneath later soil. There might once have been woven objects, wooden handles, sleeping mats, food bundles, and cords that have completely vanished. A lesser-known detail is that prehistoric archaeology is often shaped as much by preservation as by human behaviour. Coastal sites can be drowned when sea levels rise. Open camps can erode. Organic materials can disappear. Entire chapters of daily life may leave almost no trace. So when archaeologists find an empty stretch of land, empty does not always mean uninhabited. Sometimes it simply means unlucky preservation. You leave the shade and continue toward greener country. Here, trees gather more closely. The air feels heavier. Insects hum near leaves. The smell changes from dry earth to damp vegetation. You hear water somewhere ahead, not rushing, but moving gently between stones. Africa contains these contrasts on an enormous scale. Forest margins, savannas, highlands, deserts, wetlands, river valleys, and coastlines all offer different resources. Human groups living in different regions adapt their routines accordingly. Along a coast, shellfish can become an important food source. Near rivers and lakes, fish, reeds, water birds, and aquatic plants may become part of daily life. In dry interiors, knowing where seasonal water can be found may be more important than almost anything else. There is no single prehistoric lifestyle. This is easy to forget because museum displays often condense thousands of years and thousands of kilometers into one neat image of a few people standing beside a fire. Real life is messier and quieter. Imagine two groups separated by several days of travel. They may speak differently. They may prefer different stone materials. They may decorate themselves differently, tell different stories, or remember different ancestors. Then a wetter period arrives. The land between them becomes easier to cross. Perhaps they meet. Perhaps they exchange tools, partners, stories, or knowledge of distant water. Perhaps they simply observe one another with cautious curiosity. The archaeological record rarely allows you to hear the conversation. Still, The possibility matters because human survival is not only about adapting to nature, it is also about maintaining networks. A neighbouring group can offer information, a distant relative can provide shelter, a meeting can introduce a new technique. And during difficult years, those relationships may become as important as any stone tool. You follow the river until evening begins to soften the light. The heat fades, shadows stretch across the bank, small animals stir among the reeds. A bird gives a low call from somewhere you cannot quite see. Behind you lies dry grassland. Ahead, darker vegetation gathers beneath the coming night. The continent around you does not feel like one homeland. It feels like many worlds touching one another at their edges. Some are connected for a time. Some become isolated. Some open pathways that will later close again. And somewhere across this immense landscape, countless human communities are adjusting, remembering, moving, and waiting without knowing that their local decisions are slowly shaping the future of an entire species. As evening settles beside the river, you do not travel much farther. Instead, you remain near a small human camp tucked against a low rise, where a few trees offer shade and shelter from the wind. The people here know which path leads to water, where edible roots can be found, and where animals tend to pass. By the time the stars return, the camp has become quiet. A fire glows at its centre. Its flames are low now, mostly red coals breathing beneath grey ash. Occasionally, a small branch shifts and gives a soft crack. Sparks rise for a moment, then vanish into the darkness. You lie close enough to feel some warmth without letting the smoke sting your eyes. Perhaps grasses, skins, or woven plant materials lie beneath you. Although such soft objects rarely survive long enough for archaeologists to find, around you, people sleep in loose clusters. Children rest near adults. Someone turns in the night beyond the camp. Insects continue their steady chorus. Then, slowly, morning begins. Before there is any real light, one person wakes. You hear movement first. Hand brushes ash aside. A stick touches the hidden coals. Dry grass is placed carefully over the warm centre. Someone bends close and blows. For a few seconds, nothing happens. Then a thin thread of smoke rises. A faint orange glow brightens. The fire returns. A mainstream fact about early human life is that fire had already become an important part of daily survival long before 90,000 years ago. It could provide warmth, light, protection, and a way to cook food, while also creating a social centre where people gathered. Soon the camp begins to stir. You sit up and feel the coolness of dawn against your arms. The air carries the smell of smoke, damp earth, and something being warmed near the fire. There is no alarm clock. No kettle clicks on. No one reaches for a phone. And yet the morning routine has already begun. An adult checks a stone tool beside a small bundle of materials. Another person examines a wooden shaft. Someone gathers last night's leftovers. A child, still sleepy, watches without helping very much, which is perhaps one of humanity's most durable traditions. The camp is not arranged like a modern house. There are no rooms or cupboards, but there are still places where certain activities happen. Near the fire, people may cook or warm food. A little farther away, someone works stone elsewhere. Scraps from processing plants or animals accumulate. These patterns matter to archaeologists because even without walls, repeated activity can leave subtle traces in the ground. You move closer to the person repairing a tool. They hold a piece of stone carefully and strike it with another object. The sound is sharp but not loud. Tap. Pause. Tap. A small flake breaks away. The person turns the stone, studies the edge, and strikes again. Stone tools from this broad period were often made with techniques that required planning before the final useful flake was removed. The maker had to understand how stone would fracture and how earlier strikes would shape later ones. This is not random smashing. It is skilled work, and skill means learning. Perhaps a younger person sits nearby, watching. Perhaps instruction happens through demonstration. Perhaps someone corrects the angle of a hand. Perhaps there are words for different stones. edges, and mistakes. Scholars remain divided on how closely prehistoric teaching resembled deliberate instruction today, because behaviour itself does not fossilize. Still, the consistency of complex techniques suggests that knowledge had to be transmitted with care. Across the camp, another adult sorts plant foods. Roots are rubbed clean, seeds may be crushed, leaves are inspected. The work is repetitive, almost soothing to watch. For a long time, popular images of prehistory focused heavily on hunting, with spears, large animals, and dramatic chases. Daily survival was usually less theatrical. Plant foods could be essential. So could shellfish, eggs, fish, nuts, fruits, and whatever else local environments provided. The exact menu depended on where people lived and what season had arrived. You pick up a dry seed between your fingers. It weighs almost nothing, yet a handful of such foods, gathered patiently, can make the difference between a hungry day and a comfortable one. Nearby, a child imitates the adults. They pick up a small stick and poke at the earth, then they abandon it, collect a stone, and eventually wander towards someone else. Children are especially difficult to see in archaeology, even though they must have made up a significant part of prehistoric communities. Tiny footprints, unusually small tools, or objects shaped by inexperienced hands sometimes offer clues, but much of childhood disappears from the record. That is one of the quieter oddities of studying ancient life. The people who are probably among the noisiest members of the camp often leave some of the faintest traces. As the sun rises higher, the air warms, someone prepares to leave. A small group checks tools and carrying materials before setting out. They may be heading toward edible plants, a water source, or a place where animals are likely to pass. Others remain behind. Age matters, skill matters, health matters, so does circumstance. There is no reason to imagine every adult doing the same job every morning. Human societies are flexible, and that flexibility may be one reason your species survives so many different environments. You notice an older person sitting near the fire. Perhaps they no longer travel as far as younger adults, but they remember things. Where water lasted longest during a dry season, which valley becomes dangerous after heavy rain, which plants should never be eaten, where a useful kind of stone can be found. Knowledge stored in memory has enormous value. In a world without books, maps, or written instructions, a person can become a living archive. Modern life makes information feel weightless. You tap a screen and answers appear. Here, information has a voice, a face, a memory, and if someone who knows an important route dies without passing it on, that knowledge may vanish completely. The camp becomes busier as morning strengthens. Smoke rises into the pale sky. A tool is finished, food is packed. Someone laughs at something you cannot understand. For a moment, the distance of 90,000 years seems to shrink. The materials are different, the landscape is different, but the rhythm is strangely recognizable. Wake, warm yourself, find food, care for children, repair what is broken, listen to other people, prepare for the day ahead. You stand at the edge of the camp as the first group begins walking away. Their footsteps press briefly into the soft ground. By afternoon, wind may soften them. By next season, rain may erase them completely. And yet this ordinary morning, almost invisible to history, is the substance from which human history is made. Not kings, not monuments, not written records, just people waking beside a fire and beginning another day. You follow the small group away from camp while the morning is still cool. The path is not really a path in the modern sense. There are no stones placed along its edges, no signpost, no worn road stretching toward a destination. Instead, there are only remembered directions, a certain tree, a shallow ridge, a bend in the river, a patch of dark rock visible when the sun reaches it from the east. The people walking beside you know where they are going. After some time, the group reaches a low outcrop where useful stone can be collected. The ground here is scattered with fragments, some dull and weathered, others freshly broken and sharp at the edges. One person crouches and begins choosing pieces carefully. To you, Many of the stones look almost identical. To them, they are not. Some fracture cleanly, some are full of hidden flaws, some are too brittle. Others are the right size, but the wrong shape. A skilled maker can often judge quality by looking, touching, and sometimes striking the stone lightly to hear how it responds. The sound is small, a clear click, then another. The maker turns the piece slowly in one hand. Around 90,000 years ago, many Homo sapiens communities in Africa used technologies associated with the Middle Stone Age. One mainstream fact about these technologies is that toolmakers often prepared stone cores in advance so that flakes of useful size and shape could be removed deliberately. This requires planning. You watch as the maker strikes one edge, then another. At first, the stone does not resemble a finished tool at all. That is the interesting part. The person is not simply shaping what is visible in the present moment. They are working toward a future result. A strike made now changes where the next strike can happen. A surface created now affects the angle of a later blow. The finished flake exists first as an intention. You might compare it, very gently, to folding a complicated piece of paper. If the early folds are wrong, the final shape becomes difficult or impossible. Here, the material is stone, and mistakes cannot be unfolded. The maker pauses. Dust clings to the fingers. A tiny chip lands near your foot. There is no hurry. This is skilled work. And skilled work often looks calm from the outside because the difficult decisions are happening before the hands move. A younger person is watching. You recognize the same quiet pattern you saw back at camp. Look, wait, try, fail a little, try again. The younger learner receives a smaller piece of stone and begins striking it. The first blow does very little. The second removes a flake from an awkward angle. No one reacts dramatically. The older maker reaches over, adjusts the position of the stone, and demonstrates again. Researchers still debate how much formal teaching was necessary for complex prehistoric technologies. Some argue that careful imitation may have carried much of the knowledge, while others suggest that gestures, vocal instruction, and deliberate teaching would have made learning faster and more reliable. You cannot hear the exact lesson, but you can see patience. That matters. A tool tradition can survive only if knowledge survives, and knowledge does not pass automatically. Someone must watch, someone must remember, someone must care enough to repeat the process until another pair of hands can do it. You sit nearby as flakes begin to gather on the ground. Some are useful, some are waste. Some may become cutting edges, points, or scraping tools. Others may simply be the byproducts of shaping a core. One of the stranger details of archaeology is that ancient tool-making sometimes leaves behind what looks very much like prehistoric workshop rubbish. Tiny flakes can form dense patches where people repeatedly shaped stone. To the original makers, these fragments may have been worthless. To an archaeologist, tens of thousands of years later, they can be precious evidence. A discarded chip can reveal the sequence of blows used to produce a tool. It can suggest where people sat. It can even help reconstruct how raw material moved across a landscape. There is something wonderfully upside down about that. The object thrown away becomes the object carefully labelled and stored in a museum drawer. By late morning, the air has warmed. The group carries selected stone back towards camp. The weight is noticeable, stone is useful, but it is heavy. This means that good raw material can influence movement. People may return to favoured outcrops, carry prepared cores instead of large blocks, or transport finished tools farther than the original stone source. The landscape becomes a map of practical knowledge. Water here, food there, good stone beyond the ridge, shelter near the river. Nothing is marked, yet all of it is remembered. Back at camp, firelight will soon become part of the work again. Wooden shafts can be shaped. Edges can be checked. Bindings made from plant fibre, hide, or sinew may attach stone points to handles or spears. Many of these organic materials decay, which creates another quiet distortion in our picture of the past. We often find the stone and lose the object it once belonged to. A stone point in a museum case may once have been only one small part of a much more complex tool. Imagine the full object, a carefully straightened shaft, a binding wrapped tightly around the base, perhaps resin or another adhesive helping hold everything together, a hand testing the balance, a person judging whether the point sits straight. Now the tool feels less like a rock and more like technology. Some prehistoric adhesives are especially fascinating because making them can require combining materials and controlling heat with care. Evidence from different periods and regions suggests that early humans sometimes used compound glues or resins in hafting. Scholars remain divided on exactly how widespread such methods were at different times. But the basic idea is important. People were combining materials. Stone alone was useful. Wood alone was useful. Binding alone was useful. Together, they could become something better. That kind of thinking feels familiar because it still shapes technology today. The difference is mostly in scale. Your phone contains glass, metals, plastics, circuits, and software. A prehistoric spear might contain stone, wood, fibre, adhesive, and generations of practical knowledge. Both depend on many parts working together. The afternoon grows quieter. You sit close to the fire as someone inspects the edge of a newly made flake. They run a thumb near it, careful not to press too hard. The edge catches the light for a moment, nearby. The younger learner tries again. This time the strike lands correctly. A clean flake separates. There is no applause. Only a brief look between teacher and learner, perhaps a few words, perhaps a small nod. Then the work continues, and in that simple moment, something invisible has moved from one human mind into another. Not just a tool, not just a technique, it's a tradition. The next morning, you leave the camp with a different purpose. Yesterday, your attention stayed close to stone, fire, and patient hands. Today, the landscape itself becomes the tool you must learn to read. The air is cool when you begin walking. A thin mist rests over lower ground near the river, and the smell of damp soil rises with each step. Behind you, smoke from the campfire drifts upward in a narrow grey line. Ahead, the land opens into grass, scattered shrubs, and patches of darker vegetation where moisture lingers. The group moves quietly, but not because every journey is a hunt. This is one of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining prehistoric life. Modern pictures often show early humans chasing large animals with spears, as if breakfast, lunch, and dinner all required a dramatic confrontation with something enormous. In reality, survival depended on many foods gathered from many places. A mainstream fact about hunter-gatherer life is that plant foods, small animals, shellfish, fish, insects, eggs, nuts, fruits, roots, and seeds could all contribute to the diet depending on region and season. Large game mattered, but it was only one part of a much broader food system. You notice this almost immediately. One person stops beside a low patch of plants and kneels. At first, nothing looks remarkable, the leaves are dusty, the stems are thin, but a digging stick is pushed into the ground and twisted carefully. Soil loosens, a root is uncovered. It is not impressive. No one poses beside it. There is no heroic music. Yet the root contains calories, moisture, and the quiet reward of knowing where to look. You continue walking. The ground becomes warmer as the sun rises. Grasshoppers jump from your path. Birds call from a line of trees farther ahead, somewhere beyond them. Water moves slowly through reeds. The people beside you do not wander randomly. They know when certain fruits ripen. They know which trees attract birds. They know where animals come to drink. They know which roots can be eaten and which can make a person ill. This knowledge is not stored in books. It lives in memory, habit, conversation, and repeated experience. You pause at a patch of disturbed soil. Someone crouches and touches a mark in the earth. Hoof print, fresh enough to matter. The group studies it, but there is no sudden rush. Hunting large animals costs energy and carries risk. A chase that ends badly can waste hours. A smaller, dependable food source may be more valuable than a dramatic possibility. And so, the group keeps moving. There is something deeply practical about this way of life. Food is not simply found, it is scheduled by the environment. A tree may be useful for only a short part of the year, shellfish may be easier to collect at certain tides, seeds may need processing before they are edible. Animals move with water, weather, and breeding cycles. In modern life, the season can become little more than a background detail. Strawberries appear under bright supermarket lights in months when no local field would produce them. Here, the season decides the menu. You reach a shallow stream. The water is cool against your fingers. Small fish flicker near the edge, vanishing beneath shadows. Reeds bend softly in the breeze. One person checks the muddy bank for tracks while another searches among plants. A child who has come with the group collects something small from the shallows and holds it up with obvious satisfaction. It may be a shell, a pebble, or something entirely useless. Some things never change. Along coasts and waterways, shellfish could provide valuable food with relatively low risk. Archaeological sites in parts of Africa preserve shells and other remains showing that people exploited coastal resources long before the period you are visiting. One quirky detail is that prehistoric rubbish heaps can become archaeological treasure. Accumulations of shells, bones, ash, and broken tools can reveal what people ate, where they returned repeatedly, and sometimes even what season they were there. Ancient garbage, rather unfairly, can receive more scholarly attention than many ancient possessions. You walk on beneath a hotter sun. The shade of an acacia or similar tree becomes suddenly valuable. Everyone rests for a while. Water is shared. A few gathered foods are examined and sorted. The rhythm of the day is not constant effort. There are pauses. There is waiting. There is watching. Energy itself is a resource. If you spend too much of it searching for food, then the food must repay the cost. This balance shapes movement in ways that archaeologists and anthropologists still study today. Researchers continue to question exactly how much different food sources contributed to human survival in specific regions 90,000 years ago. Plant remains often decay, while bones and shells may preserve more easily, so the archaeological record can make some foods look more important simply because they survive longer. Again, preservation plays its quiet trick. Stone remains, bone sometimes remains. A basket of berries disappears, a pile of roots disappears, leaves vanish. Wood rots, and suddenly a future archaeologist is left trying to reconstruct dinner from the hardest parts of the meal. By afternoon, the group reaches higher ground. From here, you can see farther. The river glints behind you. Dry grassland stretches in one direction. Darker vegetation follows a drainage line in another. A person points toward the distance. Perhaps animals have been seen there before. Perhaps a relative once found water beyond that ridge. Perhaps the group is simply deciding which route will be worth the effort tomorrow. Food gathering is inseparable from information. Where did the herd move? Which trees are fruiting? Has the waterhole dried? Did another group pass through recently? A successful community does not need to control the landscape. It needs to understand it. That may sound modest, but it is a demanding kind of intelligence. You begin the return journey carrying more than you left with. Roots, seeds, perhaps shellfish or small animals. Perhaps nothing especially dramatic. And that is exactly the point. Prehistoric survival is often built from many small successes. One edible plant, one reliable spring, one remembered season, one person recognizing a track before anyone else. As evening approaches, the campfire comes back into view. Smoke hangs low in the cooler air. Children move near the edge of the camp. Someone working by the fire looks up as you return. The gathered food is placed down and divided. Some will be eaten soon, some may be processed, some may be shared with people who did not travel today. The meal is not the triumph of a single hunter. It is the result of memory, patience, observation, cooperation, and a landscape known almost as intimately as a modern person knows the rooms of a familiar home. You sit near the warmth while the light fades. The scent of cooked food mixes with smoke. Beyond the fire, the land grows dark again. Tomorrow, the same places may offer something different, and the people around you will notice. The fire burns lower as the evening meal comes to an end. Around you, the camp settles into a quieter rhythm. A few people continue working with their hands. Someone turns a piece of wood near the coals. Someone else checks a bundle of gathered plants. Children drift closer to older relatives, tired now, their earlier energy softening into stillness. This is when another part of prehistoric life becomes easier to notice. Not the tools, not the food, the people themselves. You have spent the day watching how humans read the land. But survival here depends just as much on reading one another. A child leans against an adult who may be a parent, an aunt, an older sibling, or simply someone trusted, nearby. Two people share food from the same small pile. Another person gestures toward the darkness beyond the fire and says something that makes several others smile. You cannot understand the words, but you understand the shape of the moment, belonging. Human beings are unusually social animals, and by 90,000 years ago, Homo sapiens almost certainly lived within networks of kin, partners, children, companions, and neighbouring groups. Archaeological evidence cannot preserve a friendship or an argument, but mobility, shared technologies, exchanged materials, and genetic evidence point toward connected populations. Those connections matter because a small group cannot know everything. One person remembers where water can be found in a dry season. Another knows how to shape a certain kind of stone. Someone else recognizes the right time to collect a particular plant. Knowledge is distributed across people. So is risk. Imagine that one hunter twists an ankle. Imagine that a child becomes ill. Imagine that a gathering trip returns with almost nothing. If food and care are shared, the entire group can absorb a bad day more easily. You watch as one person divides a portion of food and passes some to an older adult who did not travel earlier. No ceremony, just a hand reaching across the firelight. Studies of many recent hunter-gatherer societies have shown that food sharing can reduce uncertainty, especially when success varies from day to day. Living communities are not exact models of the distant past, but the general principle is useful. Cooperation can make unpredictable environments less dangerous. In other words, prehistoric insurance may have looked like someone saving you a piece of dinner. No paperwork, no password, just people remembering that tomorrow. The unlucky person might be you. The camp becomes darker, above you. Stars appear one by one. A few figures sit beyond the strongest firelight, speaking softly. Perhaps they are discussing where to travel next. Perhaps they are talking about another group encountered near the river. Perhaps they are telling a story everyone has heard many times before. You cannot know. Spoken stories vanish unless someone remembers them. Still, oral communication would have been central to maintaining social life. Routes, warnings, family histories, practical knowledge, obligations, and memories can all travel through conversation. There is still disagreement about how fully developed language was at different points in human prehistory, the anatomy associated with speech, the complexity of social behaviour, and the demands of cooperation all offer clues, but no fossil can preserve vocabulary or grammar. The voices around you, therefore, remain frustratingly silent to science. Yet it is difficult to imagine this social world without rich communication. Someone needs to explain where a distant spring lies. Someone needs to warn others about danger. Someone needs to comfort a frightened child. Someone probably needs to complain about another person taking the best sleeping place. Language, whatever its precise form, would have carried more than instructions. It would have carried relationships. You notice two adults sitting slightly apart from the others. Perhaps they are partners. Perhaps they belong to different family lines. Partnerships between groups may have been especially important because small communities that remained completely isolated for too long could face serious demographic problems. People need connections beyond the immediate camp. There may be another group a day or two away, another beyond them. People could visit, exchange information, form partnerships, share access to resources, or occasionally move from one community to another. A less familiar clue comes from stone itself. Archaeologists sometimes find raw materials transported significant distances from their geological sources. A stone flake discovered far from the place where that stone naturally occurs can hint at mobility or exchange. Of course, the stone does not tell you exactly how it travelled. One person may have carried it the entire distance. It may have passed through several hands. It may have been given as a useful object. The evidence leaves room for several interpretations. But the distance matters. It suggests that the horizon of human life could extend beyond the few kilometres visible from camp. Imagine meeting visitors. You hear them before you see them. Voices in the distance. The camp becomes attentive. Then familiar faces appear between the trees. Perhaps these are relatives. Perhaps they have visited before. People stand, children stare. Objects are set down. News arrives with them. A water source farther east has weakened. Animals have been seen near a distant valley. Someone has had a child. Someone else has died. A route is open. Another is difficult. Information moves through the network. So do customs. A particular way of preparing stone may spread. A decorative habit may appear in neighbouring groups. A new method of binding a point to a shaft may travel farther than the person who first invented it. This is one reason social connections matter so much in discussions of human evolution. Innovation is useful, but an innovation that remains inside one person's head can disappear when that person dies. Connected communities can preserve useful ideas. Some researchers have proposed that larger or better connected populations may help explain why certain technologies and symbolic behaviours become more visible at particular times. Others caution that archaeological patterns are too incomplete for simple answers. You feel that uncertainty as you sit by the fire. So much of human life happens in things that leave no durable trace. A joke, a promise, a marriage, a disagreement settled before sleep, a child learning a name, a visitor remembering a path. These moments rarely fossilize, and yet they may have shaped human survival as profoundly as any spear point. The visitors sit now among the group. Food is shared again. The fire is fed. Someone laughs softly. A child who had been fighting sleep finally gives up and curls beside an adult. The night grows cooler. You pull closer to the warmth and listen to voices rising and falling in the dark. Around 90,000 years ago, humanity does not have kingdoms, cities, markets, or written contracts, but people already have something older: trust, obligation, memory, kinship, friendship, the expectation that someone will return, the hope that someone will share, the knowledge that beyond the next ridge there may be another fire where your name is known. And as you listen, you begin to understand that the strongest technology in this ancient world may not be lying on the ground at all. It may be sitting beside you. By morning, the visitors who arrived the night before are preparing to move again. The fire has burned down to a pale bed of ash, and the first light touches the edges of the camp. Someone shakes dust from a hide. Someone else tightens a bundle. A child sits beside an older relative, watching the preparations with the serious expression children often wear when adults seem busy. Then you notice something small. Around one person's neck hangs a shell. It is not large. It does not make the wearer stronger, warmer, or faster. It cannot cut wood or carry water. Yet someone collected it, altered it, and chose to wear it. That tiny object changes the feeling of the morning. You have spent days watching people survive through food, fire, tools, and cooperation. Now you begin to see another layer of human life. People are not only surviving, they are presenting themselves to one another. You walk with the visitors as they leave camp and follow a familiar route across dry ground. The sun is still low. Long shadows stretch behind stones, and cool air remains trapped in shallow hollows. One traveller carries a lump of reddish mineral. Later, when the group pauses beneath a rock shelter, the mineral is placed on a flat stone and rubbed against another surface. Fine red powder gathers slowly. This material is ochre, an earth pigment rich in iron minerals. Red ochre appears at numerous African archaeological sites from deep prehistory, and by the period you are visiting, people in several regions were collecting and processing it. The reasons are not always clear. ochre can have practical uses. It may help in preparing hides, protecting skin, colouring materials, or contributing to adhesives in some technological contexts. But in certain places, the evidence suggests that pigment also carried visual or symbolic importance. You watch someone dip a finger into the red powder. Perhaps they mix it with fat, water, or another substance. Perhaps they rub it onto skin. Perhaps they colour an object that will not survive for 90,000 years. The red stands out against the muted colours of stone and dust. It is difficult not to wonder what it means. Does it mark a family and age, a visit, a ceremony? Or does someone simply think it looks good? Modern people sometimes expect prehistoric symbols to have grand explanations. We imagine every painted line must represent the cosmos. Every shell must belong to a ritual. Every patch of pigment must conceal a secret philosophy. The truth may occasionally have been much simpler. Someone may have liked red. Someone may have wanted to look attractive. Vanity, after all, is not a recent invention. You continue towards a region where shells can be collected. The air gradually changes. A faint mineral smell rides the breeze. Mixed with salt and wet stone, birds circle above the coast. Waves arrive in a slow rhythm, folding over themselves and pulling back across the shore. Here, the landscape provides food, but it also provides objects. Small marine shells lie among pebbles and broken fragments. Most are ignored, a few are selected. Some prehistoric shell beads found in Africa and the Levant were deliberately perforated, or show wear suggesting that they were strung and worn. Examples from sites such as Blombos Cave in South Africa and caves in North Africa have contributed to discussions about the long history of personal ornamentation. A shell used as a bead may seem insignificant compared with later jewellery made from precious metals. But think about what has to happen first. Someone notices the shell. Someone chooses it. Someone carries it away from the shore. Someone makes or uses a hole. Someone threads it onto fibre or another cord. Then someone wears it where other people can see it. The object becomes social. That is why archaeologists pay such close attention to beads. A cutting tool tells you something about practical skill. An ornament may tell you something about identity. And identity exists between people. A bead can say, in a language without written words, that you belong somewhere, that you have reached a certain stage of life, that you are connected to particular people, or simply that this object matters to you. The evidence does not allow a single interpretation. Specialists continue to weigh whether early ornaments always carried symbolic messages or whether some had more ordinary decorative roles. The line between those possibilities may be less clear than it sounds. Even today, a wedding ring can be jewellery, identity, memory, and social signal at the same time. A sports jersey can be clothing and belonging. Objects often do several things at once. You sit on a smooth stone while someone sorts shells nearby. The waves keep moving. A gull cries further down the beach. The shells click softly against one another in a hand. One especially curious detail is that some ancient beads show patterns of wear suggesting they rubbed against cord, skin, or neighbouring beads for long periods. These traces can indicate that the objects were not simply made and discarded. They may have been worn repeatedly. Imagine a shell resting against the same chest day after day. Its surface polished gradually by movement. Its meaning perhaps understood by everyone in the group without anyone needing to explain it. That is the kind of history that rarely reaches textbooks. Not a battle, not a migration, just a small object becoming personal through use. As afternoon passes, you return inland. The red ochre and pale shells now travel with the group. Perhaps they will be exchanged. Perhaps someone in another camp will recognize the style. Patterns of decoration can spread through social networks just as tool-making methods do. They can also remain local, helping distinguish one community from another. Archaeologists have long discussed when behaviour recognizable as symbolic became widespread in Homo sapiens. Earlier theories sometimes imagined a sudden creative revolution much later in prehistory. Discoveries from African sites have made that picture increasingly difficult to maintain, because evidence for pigments, engravings, ornaments, and complex technologies appears in earlier and uneven patterns. The story looks less like a switch being turned on. It looks more like many lamps appearing at different times across a vast landscape. Some burn brightly, some disappear, some may have existed where preservation has erased every trace. By evening, the group reaches another camp. A fire is already glowing. People look up as the travellers approach, and before anyone speaks, you notice something subtle. Eyes move toward the visitors' faces. Clothing, tools, and ornaments. Humans look at humans. They notice differences. They recognize familiarity. A shell catches the firelight for half a second. A streak of ochre glows dark red on someone's skin. These details may carry messages you will never understand, but the impulse behind them feels close. You know this instinct to decorate, to belong, to be recognized, to show some small piece of yourself to another person. The night gathers around the camp, and the little shell disappears into shadow. Yet its meaning, whatever that meaning once was, remains suspended somewhere between survival and selfhood. The firelight fades behind you as the path bends northward. For several days, you travel through changing country, leaving the coast and moving toward a landscape of limestone hills, open woodland, and sheltered valleys. The air is drier here. Dust settles lightly on your skin. At midday, the sun presses warmly against the rocks. But evenings arrive with a sudden coolness that gathers in the hollows. Ahead, a cave opens in the hillside. It does not look like a place where history should pause. There is no monument at the entrance, no carved name, no stone marker telling you that people once stood here with grief in their faces and memories in their minds. And yet this quiet place holds one of the most haunting traces of early Homo sapiens life. You're near Kafsa Cave, in what is now northern Israel. Long before cities, temples, roads, or written prayers, people came here. Archaeologists have uncovered human remains from Kafse that are roughly around 90,000 to 100,000 years old, making the site important in discussions of early Homo sapiens outside Africa. Some of those individuals appear to have been deliberately buried. You step inside. The temperature drops almost immediately. The air smells of stone, dust, and faint moisture. Light from the entrance reaches only partway into the cave, leaving the deeper walls in soft shadow. Your footsteps make a muted sound against the ground. Imagine standing here 90,000 years ago. A small group enters carrying a body. There is no dramatic procession, no bells, no written words, only people moving carefully. They choose a place in the earth. They dig, then they lower someone they knew into the ground. One of the strongest pieces of evidence from Kafse is that several bodies were placed in ways that many researchers interpret as intentional burial rather than accidental accumulation. A famous example is a young person buried with the antlers of a deer placed nearby or associated with the burial. It is an extraordinary detail, not because antlers are valuable in the modern sense, but because their presence raises questions. Why were they there? Were they an offering, a meaningful object? A practical item placed beside the dead or did later processes move them into a position that only appears deliberate. The evidence invites interpretation, but it does not provide a voice explaining the choice. That silence is important. You kneel near the imagined burial place. The earth feels cool beneath your hand. Outside the cave, wind moves through dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls. Inside, everything seems still. You begin to understand why burial matters so much to archaeologists. A body left where someone dies can enter the archaeological record by chance. A body placed into a prepared pit is different. It suggests action, time, effort, attention. Someone must decide what to do. Someone must help. Someone may remember the person after the soil is placed back. At Kafse, red ochre has also been found in association with some human remains and archaeological layers. The pigment you saw earlier, ground slowly beside another camp, returns here in a more mysterious context. Perhaps ochre had practical uses. Perhaps it marked the body. Perhaps it carried social or symbolic meaning. Archaeologists have not reached a single conclusion about every use of ochre at burial sites, and caution is necessary. Red pigment can be moved by natural processes, and the intentions of people from deep prehistory are difficult to reconstruct. Still, its presence makes the scene feel strangely intimate. You imagine a hand stained red, a fingertip touching skin, a small container of pigment carried into the cave. Then you remind yourself that imagination must remain separate from evidence. This is one of the gentle disciplines of studying prehistory. You're allowed to wonder. You're not allowed to pretend that wondering is proof. The people at Kafsa lived in a region that connected Africa, the Levant, and the wider landscapes of Western Asia. Human groups moved through this corridor at different times, sometimes during wetter climatic phases that made travel easier. The individuals buried here were part of one of those early expansions of Homo sapiens beyond Africa. Their journey was not necessarily part of the later population movement that gave rise to most non-African ancestry today. In fact, this is one of the deeper mysteries waiting around you. Humans can travel far, establish communities, live for generations, and then leave only faint traces. A journey does not have to lead a permanent settlement to be real. You continue deeper into the cave. Drops of water have marked parts of the stone. The floor is uneven. Your eyes adjust gradually to the darkness. One easily overlooked fact about ancient burials is that preservation itself can create strange impressions. Bones shift, sediments compress, animals disturb deposits, water moves small objects. Later humans reuse the same spaces. An archaeological burial is not a frozen photograph. It is more like a message that has spent tens of thousands of years being folded, stained, torn, and partly rewritten by the earth. Researchers remain divided on how much symbolic thought can be inferred from the earliest intentional burials. Some see deliberate placement and associated objects as evidence of ritual or ideas about death. Others urge restraint, noting that burial can also serve practical purposes, such as removing a body from living space or protecting it from scavengers. The difference matters, but perhaps the possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A practical act can also carry emotion. Modern people understand this without difficulty. You can close a door because the room is cold and because you do not want to hear the noise outside. One action can hold several reasons, so perhaps burial did too. You sit near the cave entrance as afternoon light turns softer. The world outside continues without ceremony. Wind moves leaves, insects hum. Clouds drift above the hills. The people who lived here did not know that one day strangers would study their bones, measure the sediments around them, and argue carefully over what their actions meant. They simply lived, and then, like everyone, they died. What makes Kafsa so moving is not death itself, it is attention. Someone appears to have noticed that the dead should be treated differently from ordinary refuse, differently from broken stone, differently from the remains of food. That distinction feels small, but it opens an enormous door. If people treated the dead with care, what did they remember? Did they speak names after someone was gone? Did children ask where a missing person had gone? Did adults return to the burial place? No excavation can answer those questions clearly. The cave keeps its silence. Evening gathers outside. You step back into the cooler air and look toward the darkening hills. Behind you! The cave remains open in the rock, holding its ancient dead without explanation, and as the first stars appear, you carry one quiet thought with you. Long before history could record a single name, humans were already learning how difficult it is to say goodbye. Night settles over the hills beyond Kafsa, and when you begin walking again, the cave slowly disappears behind you. The land ahead does not offer a single road. There is no marked route pointing east, no ancient sign telling you where Homo sapiens will go next. Instead, there are valleys, dry ridges, river corridors, coastlines, and stretches of open country that become easier or harder to cross as climate shifts. You move through this landscape one careful day at a time. The people around you are not marching toward a destination called the future. They are looking for water, food, shelter, familiar stone, safer ground, and perhaps other people. That difference matters. Modern maps tempt us to draw arrows. One arrow leaves Africa, another crosses Arabia, another continues into Asia. The lines look clean. Human movement was not. Evidence from fossils and archaeology shows that Homo sapiens reached regions beyond Africa well before the later expansion that contributed most of the ancestry of living non-African populations. Sites in the Levant preserve early modern human remains from more than 90,000 years ago. And other evidence suggests that people explored neighbouring regions during favourable climatic periods. You walk beside one of those early populations. The morning air is cool. Loose stones shift underfoot. Small shrubs cling to the slopes far below. A strip of greener vegetation follows water through the valley. No one knows how long this group has been moving. Perhaps their parents were born nearby. Perhaps their grandparents came from farther south. Migration, at this scale, may not feel like migration at all. A family moves to a better water source years later. Their children move again. A neighbouring group follows animals into another valley. Generations pass. Eventually, descendants live hundreds of kilometres from where their ancestors began. Even though no single person ever made an enormous journey, that is one of the quieter ways humanity spreads. Not through one heroic expedition, but through many ordinary decisions. You reach a shallow stream and kneel. The water is cold enough to sting your fingers. Someone fills a container made from material that will never survive in the archaeological record. Perhaps hide, perhaps bark, perhaps woven fibre. Then the group rests beneath a patch of shade. You notice that several stone tools are made from material that does not seem to match the rock around you. That small detail can matter. When archaeologists find stone far from its geological source, it can suggest long-distance movement, exchange, or repeated travel between regions. The stone itself becomes a kind of silent travel record. It cannot tell you who carried it or why, but it tells you that people and objects did not always stay close to home. One especially curious feature of early human dispersal is how often the archaeological story seems to flicker. People appear in one region, then evidence becomes scarce. Later, humans appear again. This can create the illusion of mysterious disappearance. But many explanations are possible. Climate may have changed, populations may have shifted elsewhere, groups may have merged, sites may remain undiscovered, sea level changes may have submerged important coastal routes beneath modern water. The past is incomplete because the Earth is not a perfect archive. You continue walking. By afternoon, the land grows warmer and more open. Dust hangs close to the ground. The smell of dry vegetation replaces the cool scent of the morning valley. You begin to appreciate how much climate controls these journeys. During wetter phases, regions that are difficult today may have held lakes, grasslands, and connected habitats. Animals could move through them, and humans could follow. During drier phases, those same landscapes could become barriers. This creates movement that pulses, advance, pause, retreat, return. There is still no single agreed picture of how many early dispersals occurred, exactly when each happened, or how much they contributed to later populations. Genetics adds another layer. Most people living outside Africa today trace much of their ancestry to a later major expansion of Homo sapiens, often placed broadly after about 70,000 years ago. Although the exact timing and routes continue to be refined, that means some earlier travellers may have left little genetic legacy in most living populations. You stop and consider that a whole community can exist. Children can be born. People can fall in love. Old people can teach roots. Families can remember grandparents. Generations can pass, and still, tens of thousands of years later, their ancestry may be faint, lost, absorbed, or difficult to detect. History often treats survival as success and disappearance as failure. Prehistory is less tidy. A population that leaves no clear descendants still lived complete human lives. They still watched sunsets. They still laughed. They still became tired. They still knew the smell of rain before it arrived. Nothing about those lives was unfinished simply because their lineage did not dominate the future. Toward evening, you reach higher ground. From here, the horizon opens. You can imagine routes spreading in several directions. north toward the Levant, east toward Arabia, south and west back toward Africa. Perhaps none of these routes stays open forever. Perhaps some are remembered only for a few generations. A person beside you points toward distant hills. The gesture is simple. There may be water there. There may be people there. There may be danger. You cannot know which. And this is another difficulty in reconstructing migration. Archaeologists often see the beginning and the end of a movement, but not the thoughts in between. A fossil appears in one region, a tool tradition appears in another. Dates overlap imperfectly, and then researchers try to reconstruct the journey. Some specialists favour repeated ways of expansion during favourable climate windows. Others emphasise that populations may have remained connected across broad regions for long periods, moving back and forth rather than simply outward. The distinction matters because the old image of a single departure from Africa is too simple. Humanity behaves less like an arrow, it behaves more like water. It spreads when pathways open, it gathers in favourable places, it divides around barriers, it sometimes returns along routes used before. You descend toward a sheltered basin as the light begins to fade. Smoke rises ahead, another camp. The people beside you slow slightly. Perhaps they recognise someone. Perhaps this group speaks in a familiar way. Perhaps the meeting will be cautious. You remember the shell ornaments, the ochre, the distant stone, and the social networks stretching between camps. Movement does not only carry bodies, it carries habits, tools, stories, partners, memories. A person arriving from far away can bring knowledge of another landscape into this one. The fire ahead grows brighter as darkness gathers. You approach slowly. There is no sense that you are witnessing the beginning of a grand conquest. Only another meeting, another route, another evening, and somewhere behind you, countless footprints are already fading from the ground. Some belong to journeys that will continue. Some belong to journeys that will end. All of them are part of the same restless human story. The new camp rests beneath a limestone ridge, and when morning comes, you find yourself drawn toward another cave. The entrance is broad enough to catch the early light. Dust glows softly where the sun reaches the floor, while deeper inside, the stone remains cool and grey. A faint smell of smoke seems almost permanent here, as if countless fires have settled into the rock itself. This region, the Levant, is one of the great crossroads of human prehistory. Africa lies to the south. Eurasia opens to the north and east. During favourable climatic periods, people can move through greener corridors following animals, water, and familiar plant zones. During harsher periods, those same routes become difficult, narrowing movement and isolating populations. And this morning, the cave seems to hold evidence of just how complicated that movement became. You notice stoneflakes scattered near an old hearth. They look familiar. Prepared cores, sharp flakes, points shaped through methods that require planning. At first, you might assume the people who made them were Homo sapiens, but that assumption would be risky. In the Levant, both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals used broadly similar Middle Paleolithic stone technologies. At some sites, tools alone cannot reliably tell archaeologists which kind of human made them. That is a wonderfully inconvenient fact. We like the past to label itself clearly. Neanderthal tool, Homo sapiens tool. Please place each in the correct museum drawer. The ancient world refuses to cooperate. You walk farther into the cave. Imagine another group occupying the shelter thousands of years after the people you followed at Kafse. Their bodies are different in certain ways. They are powerfully built. Their faces tend to project more in the middle. Their brow regions are pronounced. Their bones reflect populations adapted across Western Eurasia over a very long period. They are Neanderthals, and they are human, not failed humans, not slow creatures waiting for your species to replace them. They care for one another, make sophisticated tools, control fire, hunt effectively, and adapt to difficult environments. The fossil record of the Levant shows that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied this broad region at different times, sometimes in patterns that appear to alternate. Homo sapiens are known from sites such as School and Kafse more than 90,000 years ago, while later Neanderthal remains are known from places including Kibera and Amud. This shifting record has made the Levant central to debates about how the two populations moved through Southwest Asia. You sit beside the cold remains of an imagined hearth. A Neanderthal hand places wood onto the fire. The flame catches. Light moves across the cave wall. The scene does not feel alien. Someone works stone, someone processes food, someone watches a child, someone rests after a long day. If you removed the faces and bones from the picture, many parts of daily life might look surprisingly difficult to assign to one population or the other. That similarity has become even more interesting as new discoveries appear. Recent work at Tin Shemet Cave in Israel, dating broadly to around 100,000 years ago, has added evidence of human remains, ochre, stone tools, and intentional burial within a period of notable human diversity in the Levant. Researchers have suggested that some shared behaviours across populations may reflect interaction rather than complete separation. Although the exact relationships remain open to investigation, you let that possibility settle quietly. Interaction. It is a simple word covering many possible encounters. Perhaps groups watched one another from a distance. Perhaps they competed for the same water or game. Perhaps they exchanged knowledge. Perhaps individuals moved between communities. And perhaps, sometimes, they had children together. Genetic evidence from later populations has shown that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did interbreed at various points in prehistory. The details of where and when remain complex, but the old idea of two entirely separate human worlds is no longer convincing. The Levant may have been one of several regions where proximity made contact possible. Still, you should resist turning every cave into a meeting place. Archaeology works with fragments. A layer containing Neanderthal remains may be separated from a Homo sapiens layer by thousands of years. Two populations can use the same shelter without ever seeing one another. This is where the cave begins to feel almost like a very slow hotel. Guests arrive, guests leave. The room remains, only the guest book is missing. One lesser noticed detail is that caves can preserve repeated occupations with remarkable complexity. Ash, bones, stone flakes, sediments, and discarded objects accumulate layer by layer. Later occupants may disturb earlier deposits. Water can move material. Animals can burrow through sediments. Reading the sequence requires enormous care. A few centimeters of earth might represent generations. Another layer might represent centuries. An apparent overlap might vanish when dating improves. The cave floor is not a calendar. You step back toward the entrance. Outside, the afternoon has become warmer. Wind moves through low vegetation. A bird circles above the ridge. You imagine a Homo sapiens group crossing this valley during one climatic phase. Thousands of years later, Neanderthals move through the same place. Then conditions change again. Another population arrives. This does not look like a simple conquest. It looks like a frontier shaped by climate. As environments shift, populations expand and contract. Suitable habitats move. Familiar prey changes range. Groups follow what they know. Some specialists emphasize competition when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied nearby territories. Others point to growing evidence that cultural similarity, genetic mixing, and shared landscapes make the relationship more complicated than a simple struggle between rivals. The evidence does not force you to choose one peaceful story or one hostile story. Human relationships are rarely that tidy. Even neighbouring modern communities can trade, compete, marry, imitate, avoid, and misunderstand one another at the same time. Why should prehistory be simpler? Evening approaches. You sit outside the cave as shadows gather along the limestone walls. Somewhere in this region, a Neanderthal family may be tending a fire. Elsewhere, Homo sapiens may be doing the same. They look different enough for bones to preserve clues. Yet their days may contain many of the same concerns. Water, food, children, weather, safe shelter, useful stone, other people. The sky darkens slowly. You remember the cave at Kafse and the careful burial there. Now you think about other caves used by other humans. The boundaries between them no longer feel sharp. Instead, the Levant becomes what it may always have been: a corridor, a meeting zone, a place where populations arrive, disappear, return, and sometimes leave traces in one another. You listen to the wind moving across the cave entrance. For a moment, it sounds almost like distant breathing. Then the sound fades. The cave grows dark again, patient enough to wait for whoever comes next. When you leave the limestone caves behind, the land opens gradually toward the southeast. At first, the change is subtle. The hills become lower. The distances feel wider. The air grows warmer during the day, and the horizon stretches farther than before. You're moving toward Arabia, a place that, from a modern map, may seem like a severe barrier of sand and stone, but 90,000 years ago, it does not always look like the Arabia you know today. There are periods when rain reaches farther north. Grasslands spread. Lakes appear in basins that will one day become dry desert. Animals move into regions that seem almost impossible to imagine as green in the present, and humans follow. You walk beneath a pale morning sky, across ground softened by patches of grass. Small hoof prints mark the damp edge of a shallow pool. Birds gather near reeds. Insects hum around the water. The scene feels unexpectedly alive. This is one of the great surprises of prehistoric Arabia. The desert is not permanent. Its character changes repeatedly as Earth's climate responds to long cycles in orbit, rainfall, and monsoon strength. During wetter episodes, parts of the Arabian interior can support lakes, grasslands, and animal communities that create temporary corridors for human movement. The route in front of you is one of those corridors. There is no green highway stretching neatly from Africa to Asia. Instead, there are patches, a lake here, a river or wetland there, open grassland between them. A traveller who knows where water lies can move through country that will later become far more difficult. You follow animal tracks toward a broad basin. The ground becomes softer. Ahead, water reflects the sky. People gather near its edge. Some are collecting plants, others scan the shallows. Children move through mud that squishes around their feet. The sound of frogs comes from the reeds. If you visited this place in the modern era, you might struggle to believe the scene ever existed. Yet ancient lake sediments still survive beneath parts of Arabia, preserving evidence of these wetter phases. One place is especially important. Al-Wusta lies in the Nafud Desert of what is now Saudi Arabia. Today, the surrounding region is dry, but the ancient deposits tell a very different story. At Al-Wusta, researchers found the fossilized finger bone of a Homo sapiens individual along with stone tools and animal remains. Dating places the human presence there roughly between 95,000 and 86,000 years ago. Close to the period through which you are now walking, you imagine the owner of that small bone, not as a fossil, as a person. Perhaps the finger grips a wooden shaft. Perhaps it lifts water. Perhaps it points toward animals moving beside the lake. Perhaps it simply scratches an itch. The ordinariness of those possibilities feels almost more remarkable than any dramatic story. One tiny bone survives. Almost everything else about the person disappears. No name, no face, no voice. Only enough to say, with extraordinary quietness, someone like you was here. The animals around Al-Wusta add another layer to the picture. Fossils from the site indicate a landscape very different from the barren desert of today, with creatures suited to grassland and freshwater environments. The researchers who described the site linked the human occupation to a humid climatic phase with stronger rainfall. You continue along the lake. Hooves have churned sections of the shore. A large animal drinks farther away. Birds rise suddenly and settle again. The smell is a mixture of mud, vegetation, and warm water. It resembles an African savanna more than the modern Nefud. That similarity may have mattered. If people leaving northeastern Africa encountered familiar grassland habitats spreading into Arabia, the journey would not require them to master an entirely alien environment overnight. They could follow ecological conditions they already understood. Water attracts animals. Animals create tracks. Plants grow around wet places. People recognize the pattern. Research from other Arabian sites has strengthened this broader picture. Ancient lake sequences in northern Arabia record repeated episodes when hominin populations entered the region during wetter windows over hundreds of thousands of years. The landscape appears to have opened and closed again and again rather than serving as a permanently accessible route. That changes how you imagine migration. You no longer see one brave group stepping into an endless desert. You see doors opening, then closing, then opening again generations later. The door is made of rain. A particularly charming detail comes from the ancient lake beds themselves, in places that now look impossibly dry. Researchers can find shells, animal fossils, sediment layers, and traces of aquatic environments. The desert, in other words, keeps evidence of its former lakes hidden beneath its feet. A dry basin becomes a kind of sleeping shoreline. You stop near the water as clouds gather in the distance. Perhaps rain falls somewhere beyond the horizon. People around you pay attention. Rain is not background noise here. It determines where grass will grow and where animals may move months later. A wet season can reshape an entire route. Several explanations remain under discussion for exactly how these humid phases influenced human dispersal. Climate clearly mattered, but people were not simply carried across Arabia by rainfall like leaves on a stream. Social networks, population size, knowledge of water, local technology, and chance would all have influenced who moved and who stayed. The environmental doorway could open. Someone still had to walk through it. You begin moving again in the late afternoon. The group follows higher ground between wet areas. Stone tools are carried, food is divided, children remain close to adults. The same social world you saw beside African fires now moves through Arabia. That continuity feels important. Nothing about these travellers suggests that they suddenly became different people simply because they crossed a geographic boundary. They're still solving familiar problems. Where is water? Where is shade? Which animals passed here recently? Who knows the next stopping place? Modern borders would mean nothing to them. Even the words Africa and Arabia would mean nothing in the sense you understand them. There is only landscape. Near sunset, you climb a low rise behind you. The lake catches the last light. Beyond it, grass fades into open country. Farther still, another basin may hold water. Another group may already be there. Perhaps travellers from the Levant have moved south. Perhaps people from Africa have moved east. Perhaps their paths will cross beside a lake whose name will not exist for tens of thousands of years. The sun slips lower, air cools against your face, bird calls soften near the shore. For a brief prehistoric moment, Arabia is green enough to welcome travellers. And you begin to understand that some of humanity's oldest roads were never roads at all. They were temporary landscapes, drawn in grass and water, then erased when the rain moved away. The green corridors of Arabia carry you farther east and north, until the world begins to feel larger than before. The lakes and grasslands behind you are still part of the journey, but ahead lies something more unsettling and more fascinating. You're entering a continent that is not empty. Other humans are already here, not one kind, several. The realization arrives slowly, perhaps first through tracks, a hearth abandoned before your group arrives. A cluster of stone flakes made in a style that feels familiar, but not quite the same. A shelter where ash lies beneath a thin layer of dust. Someone has been here. Someone who is human. Someone who may not belong to your own population. You stand beside the cold remains of a fire and look around. The wind moves softly through scrub. The afternoon light is pale, far away. A line of hills fades into haze. There are no labels on their landscape, no sign saying Neanderthal territory, no border marking where another population begins, just country and people by this period. Neanderthals are established across large parts of Europe and Western Asia, farther east. Populations related to Denisovans also exist, though you will not recognize them by that name. Other ancient human lineages may survive in regions where the fossil record remains thin. The old idea of one human species steadily replacing another in a simple sequence now feels far too neat. The prehistoric world is crowded with cousins. Some are close cousins, some are more distant. You walk through a valley where the air is colder than it was in Arabia. The vegetation changes. The nights bite harder. A person beside you wraps material more closely around their shoulders. The group finds shelter near the rocky overhang. There are signs that others have used it. A patch of charcoal, broken bone, stone tools, but the makers are gone. You sit near the entrance and imagine them. Perhaps they were Neanderthals. Their bodies were generally stockier than those of many Homo sapiens, with powerful limbs and anatomical features shaped by long evolutionary history in Eurasia. They were well adapted to their environments for decades. Popular culture treated Neanderthals as crude and dim, almost as if evolution had placed them in the story merely to lose. The evidence has been steadily correcting that picture. Neanderthals made sophisticated stone tools, used fire, hunted large animals, cared for injured companions, and occupied a wide range of landscapes. They were not failed versions of you. They were themselves, and for long periods they were very successful. You notice a stone point near the imagined hearth. Its edges are carefully worked. If it were lying alone in a museum case without context, you might struggle to guess which human population made it. That uncertainty matters. Technology does not always map neatly onto biology. Two populations can solve similar problems in similar ways. Cold weather does not care who your ancestors were. Sharp stone works for everyone, wood burns for everyone. A sheltered cave is useful to everyone. The more you think about it, the less strange shared behavior becomes. One overlooked detail is that the fossil record represents only a tiny fraction of the humans who once lived. Most individuals leave nothing that lasts. Bones decay, camps erode, coastlines disappear beneath rising seas. So the apparent gaps between populations may sometimes reflect missing evidence rather than true emptiness. You continue walking after sunrise. The landscape rises gradually. There is a different quality to the light here, thinner and cooler. A flock of birds crosses overhead. Someone in your group stops beside a stream and studies the mud. Human footprints would be possible here, if they existed, though they might belong to someone you would not expect. Farther into Asia, the story becomes even stranger. In the modern era, researchers recovered genetic material from small fossil remains found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. That evidence revealed a population now called the Denisovans, a group related to Neanderthals but genetically distinct. What they looked like remains partly mysterious. The physical evidence is fragmentary compared with the genetic record. A finger bone, teeth. Other remains assigned through later study. It is almost absurd how much of an ancient population can be revealed by so little material. A tiny fragment enters a laboratory. Suddenly, an entire branch of humanity appears. You pause beside the stream and let that thought settle. How many other branches left? Nothing readable. How many populations lived in places where bone never preserved? How many names for humanity existed only in languages that vanished completely? There is no final answer, and the uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the landscape. Competing interpretations continue to shape how researchers reconstruct contact among these groups. Genetic studies show clearly that later Homo sapiens populations interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But exactly where every episode occurred, how often it happened, and what social relationships surrounded those encounters remain difficult to recover. The genes tell you contact happened. They do not tell you how the first meeting felt. You imagine two groups noticing each other across open ground. Perhaps they are cautious, perhaps curious, perhaps afraid. Perhaps none of those feelings remains dominant for long. One community might possess knowledge of a valley, another might know where good stone lies. People could compete over resources and still learn from one another. They could avoid each other and later exchange partners. They could fight in one generation and cooperate in another. Modern history provides more than enough examples of neighbours having complicated relationships. There is little reason to expect the deep past to be simpler. By afternoon, your group climbs towards another shelter. Smoke rises from somewhere ahead. This time, it may not belong to people like those you have been following. You slow. The people beside you slow too. No one speaks loudly. The smell of smoke reaches you before the fire becomes visible. Then voices, different perhaps, or perhaps only unfamiliar. The moment remains calm. You are not watching a grand confrontation between species. You are witnessing proximity. That alone is significant. For thousands of years, different human populations could occupy overlapping regions, moving as climate changed and habitat shifted. Sometimes they may have missed one another by centuries, sometimes by a valley, sometimes, almost certainly, they met. And when they did, the boundaries between them were not always permanent. You know that because pieces of those encounters still survive inside human genomes today. The fire ahead flickers through the trees. You cannot yet see the faces around it. Only movement, only light, only the ancient fact that someone else is there. The world feels suddenly more populated, more complicated, more human. And as evening begins to gather, you understand that Homo sapiens did not enter Eurasia as the only people on Earth. You entered a world already inhabited by relatives, rivals, neighbours, strangers, and possible kin. The continent was not waiting for humanity. Humanity was already everywhere in more than one form. The fire ahead belongs to strangers, but the meeting passes quietly. By morning, your group is moving again. The land changes beneath your feet as days become weeks. Valleys narrow, then open. Rivers appear and vanish. Trees thin into grassland somewhere far beyond your sight. Climates shift across entire regions, and human communities respond without ever knowing that future generations will try to compress all these movements into a single explanation. This is where one of the most persistent stories about prehistoric humanity begins to creep into the journey. The story says that something terrible happened, a catastrophe, a sudden collapse, a moment when humanity nearly disappeared. It is an appealing idea because it gives the distant past a dramatic centre. One event, one crisis, one narrow escape, but the evidence around 90,000 years ago does not fit comfortably into such a simple story. You stop beside a shallow lake as evening approaches. The water is perfectly still near the reeds. Insects hover above the surface, and a few birds call from the opposite shore. Nothing about the scene feels like the edge of extinction. Small human populations certainly face danger. Long drought can be devastating. Disease can pass through a group. Food supplies can fail. Communities can become isolated. Yet hardship is not the same thing as a single global collapse. Genetic studies do show that human populations experience bottlenecks at different times, meaning periods when the number of ancestors contributing to later populations became relatively small. Some of those events are associated with later dispersals out of Africa, while other proposed bottlenecks lie vastly deeper in time. The dates matter. A much-discussed genetic study published in 2023 proposed an extremely severe bottleneck among human ancestors roughly 900,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens existed. That is nearly 10 times farther into the past than the world you're walking through now. It is surprisingly easy for such dates to blur together in popular retellings. 90,000, 900,000. Once several zeros appear, prehistory can become rather impolite to the sleepy listener, but they describe completely different chapters. You continue along the lake shore. The group spreads out slightly, looking for plants and tracks. Humanity around 90,000 years ago is probably not one small population gathered in one refuge. Homo sapiens communities occupy different parts of Africa, and some have already travelled into the Levant and Arabia. These groups are separated, connected, reunited, and separated again as environments change. Population size is therefore complicated. A local group can disappear while the wider species remain secure. A region can lose inhabitants while another supports growing communities. A migration can fail without humanity failing. This patchwork matters more than a single dramatic number. Later in your journey, about 16,000 years after the period you're visiting, another event will become famous. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba volcano in what is now Indonesia erupts on an enormous scale. Ash and volcanic material spread across vast distances. For years, researchers discussed whether this eruption produced a severe volcanic winter and drove human populations close to extinction. The idea became popular partly because it was easy to picture. A colossal eruption, darkened skies, cold years, a tiny band of survivors. It sounds almost designed for a documentary trailer. The archaeological evidence, however, has made the picture much less tidy. At sites on the southern coast of South Africa, microscopic traces of toba ash have been identified within archaeological sequences that show humans living through the event. Rather than revealing a clear abandonment, the evidence indicates continued human activity in that region. Farther east, another remarkable sequence appears at Darbar in northern India. Stone tools occur in layers dating before and after the Toba eruption, suggesting continued occupation across the event rather than a clean break in human presence. You imagine ash falling somewhere far away. Perhaps it settles as a faint film. Perhaps people notice an unusual sky. Perhaps distant communities experience environmental effects while others notice very little. A catastrophe can be enormous without affecting every place equally. That is one of the quieter lessons hidden in prehistoric climate. Distance matters, wind matters, local ecology matters. A fertile coast may buffer hardship differently from an arid interior. A group with strong social connections may cope differently from an isolated one. People are not passive figures waiting for the environment to decide their fate. They move, they share, they change diets, they alter routes. They remember where resources survived during earlier difficult years. This adaptability does not make them invulnerable. It simply makes the story more human. One easily missed clue comes from the material left around ancient camps. If a disaster truly emptied an entire region, archaeologists might expect a clear interruption in occupation. Sometimes such interruptions exist, but elsewhere. Toolmaking continues. Hearths continue, people keep returning. That continuity can be as revealing as disappearance. You sit beneath a tree while afternoon heat begins to soften. Someone nearby repairs a tool. Another person crushes plant material between stones. Children move between the adults. The ordinary scene feels almost stubborn. That may be the wrong word, because no one here knows they are demonstrating resilience for future researchers. They are simply living. Still, ordinary life can survive extraordinary conditions. There are competing interpretations of how strongly Toba affected global climate and human populations. Some models have suggested substantial cooling, while archaeological evidence from several regions argues against a simple worldwide human collapse caused by the eruption. The question has shifted from asking whether one volcano nearly erased humanity to asking how environmental effects differed from place to place. That is a more difficult question. It is also a more interesting one. You look across the landscape again, around 90,000 years ago. There is no single mysterious event that explains everything happening to Homo sapiens. There are wetter phases, drier phases, population movements, isolation, meetings, local extinctions, new settlements, technological traditions that appear, disappear, and return. Humanity is not passing through one narrow doorway. It is navigating a maze of many doors. Some close, others open. Some groups walk down paths that leave descendants. Others vanish into branches of history that genetics and archaeology can barely detect. As evening arrives, the lake darkens from blue to grey. A breeze moves across the water, someone adds wood to the fire. The flame grows gently. You think about how much we want the distant past to contain one great answer, one catastrophe, one bottleneck, one moment when everything changed. But prehistory rarely offers that kind of neatness. The real story is slower. Human populations bend under pressure, they fragment, they reconnect, they lose people, they gain territory. They endure years that must have felt difficult and others that probably felt pleasantly ordinary. The fire crackles beside you, the stars return, and somewhere in the immense darkness, other human camps are glowing too. Not one last camp, not one final family. Many fires, many communities, many small chances for the human story to continue. By the time another morning arrives, the lake beside your camp has changed colour, the surface is silver under the weak light, and a thin breeze pushes small ripples toward the reeds. Beyond the water, The land looks peaceful, almost settled. But the climate around you is never truly still. Across years and generations, rainfall shifts, some lakes shrink, some rivers become unreliable. Grasslands retreat from places where animals once fed. Elsewhere, new wet corridors appear and invite movement. You walk along the shore and notice a dark band of damp sediment above the current waterline. It marks an earlier level. The lake was once higher, perhaps only a little, perhaps much more. To the people living here, that difference is practical rather than scientific. A smaller lake means fewer reliable places to drink. It can change where animals gather. It can alter which plants grow nearby. It can make a familiar camp less useful than it was in the time of someone's grandparents. You follow a group inland, the grass becomes thinner, dust rises around your ankles. A few shrubs cling to shallow depressions where moisture lasts longer. Someone points toward a distant line of trees. Water may still be found there. The group turns. This is how climate changes the road, not by drawing a new route on a map, but by making one path less rewarding and another suddenly necessary. Around 90,000 years ago, Earth was moving through part of the last glacial period, and climate conditions varied greatly across regions in Africa and Southwest Asia. Changing rainfall patterns repeatedly transformed lakes, grasslands, deserts, and migration corridors. These shifts happened over many scales. Some were slow enough for several generations to adapt gradually. Others may have produced noticeable changes within a lifetime. You imagine an older person walking beside you. They remember a place you passed yesterday when they were young. Perhaps water remained there through most of the dry season. Now the pool disappears earlier. They remember animals gathering in larger numbers. They remember reeds where today there is only cracked soil. That memory becomes useful information in the absence of written records. Environmental history lives inside people. A child may learn a route not because it is good today, but because an older relative remembers that it becomes useful when the rains return. You continue toward the trees. The shade feels cooler when you finally reach it. There is water, but not much. Several shallow pools remained beneath a bank. Tracks overlap around them. Antelope, birds, perhaps larger animals, human footprints join the confusion. This is a place many creatures need. Water can bring life together, but it can also bring competition. A group that once had several choices may now have only one. That changes social life as well as movement. People may encounter neighbouring communities more often. They may share information. They may avoid one another. They may negotiate access. There is no written treaty beside the pool, only memory and relationships. The strange thing is that a difficult climate can sometimes connect people as much as it separates them. When usable habitat becomes patchy, communities may converge on the same favourable zones. At other times, expanding deserts or shrinking forests create barriers so wide that populations lose contact for generations. This back-and-forth pattern is one reason ancient human populations could become genetically and culturally distinct, then reconnect later. A less obvious clue lies in lake sediments and mineral deposits inside caves. Layers of mud, pollen, dust, and chemical signatures can preserve traces of past rainfall and vegetation. Tiny particles become evidence for landscapes that no longer exist. A handful of sediment can describe a vanished lake. A cave deposit can hint at decades or centuries of wetter conditions. The past sometimes hides its largest changes inside its smallest materials. You sit in the shade and watch someone scoop water carefully. No one wastes it. The day is growing hot. A child dips fingers into the pool and is gently moved aside. Perhaps there is a lesson in that gesture. Water is not simply available. It must be respected. You move again when the sun begins to lower. Farther west, regions that were once green may be drying. Farther east, a wetter interval may be opening new habitat. Humans respond in different ways. Some groups stay near dependable rivers. Some move toward coasts, where marine resources can offer another kind of stability. Some travel into highlands. Others follow animals across grasslands that exist only during favourable climatic windows. There is no single human response because there is no single human landscape. Researchers have proposed several models for how climate shaped prehistoric population movements. Some emphasize humid corridors that open routes across North Africa and Arabia. Others caution that humans were flexible enough to cross or occupy harsher environments under some conditions, and that social knowledge may have mattered as much as rainfall itself. The old picture of humans simply following green land like a trail of stepping stones is probably too simple. People can improvise. They can store knowledge. They can change diets. They can travel farther between water sources. They can use coastlines or rivers as anchors. Climate creates pressure. Human behavior decides how some of that pressure is answered. You reach a ridge near sunset. From here, you can see the valley behind you. The waterhole is hidden now. The lake where you began the morning is only a pale patch in the distance. Imagine returning here 20 years later. The lake may be smaller or larger. The grass may have moved farther across the plain. A route that feels obvious today may have disappeared. This is why prehistoric maps should almost breathe. Their borders shift, their rivers wander, their shorelines move during glacial periods. Sea levels can fall, exposing land that is underwater today. Later, rising seas erase coastal camps and routes beneath waves. Some of the paths humans used may now lie far offshore. That is another curious distortion in the archaeological record. We study ancient coastlines from modern land, even though parts of the most useful ancient coast may be submerged. Whole camps may sleep beneath shallow seas. The routes remain invisible because the water arrived later. You sit on the ridge as the heat fades. A cool current of air moves upward from the valley. Someone beside you looks back toward the land you crossed. Perhaps they are deciding whether this place will still be worth visiting next season. Perhaps they already know the answer. Tomorrow, the group may continue toward another source of water. The year after that, they may travel farther. Their children may grow up knowing a slightly different map. Then their children may know another. No single generation has to witness a great transformation. The world can change through small adjustments. A shorter rainy season, a lake retreating a little farther, a herd choosing another valley, a camp used less often, a path gradually forgotten. This is how landscapes can reshape human history without any sudden disaster. You look across the darkening plain, the first stars appear somewhere beyond the horizon, rain is falling. Here, the ground remains dry. And between those two places, people are already deciding where to walk next. The path carries you onward through a landscape that has begun to feel almost familiar. You recognize the logic now. Water draws people, grass draws animals, stone draws tool makers, shelter gathers memories, and when one of those things disappears, movement begins again. Yet the farther you travel, the more another idea starts to trouble you. What happens to the journeys that do not continue? You've already walked beside people moving through the Levant and Arabia. You've seen camps appear beside lakes, caves, rivers and ridges. You've imagined families settling for a season, perhaps for generations. Some of those people will leave descendants who continue moving, others may not. A population can travel hundreds of kilometers, establish itself in a new region, and still contribute little or nothing to the ancestry of most people living there much later. That does not mean the journey failed. It means history branched. You begin the day beside a narrow valley where water runs between pale stones. The air is cool in the shade. Someone washes mud from a root. A child tosses a pebble into the stream and watches the circles spread outward. The image is simple, but it fits the story. A human population can spread in the same way. One group separates, then another. Some branches grow, some shrink, some reconnect with others. Some disappear completely. Genetic studies of living people and ancient remains suggest that the ancestry of most present-day populations outside Africa traces largely to a later expansion of Homo sapiens, generally after the period you are visiting now. That later movement did not erase the reality of earlier expansions. It simply means those earlier groups may have left a faint genetic contribution, one that was later absorbed, reduced, or lost. The people at places such as Kafse remind you of this. They were already living beyond Africa long before the main ancestry of many later Eurasian populations became established. They were not merely scouts sent ahead by history, they were communities. Imagine one of them waking in the morning. They do not know that scientists tens of thousands of years later will ask whether their descendants survived. They care about the weather. A child has a cough. A tool needs repair. Someone has gone to find water. A relative is expected from another camp. That is the scale at which life is actually lived. Population genetics sees patterns across thousands of generations. People experience breakfast. You continue uphill, the valley narrows behind you. A few people in the group turn to look back. Perhaps they are leaving a place permanently, perhaps not. Movement in prehistory is rarely final in the moment. A route can be retraced. A camp can be revisited. A community can split and reunite years later. But eventually, some departures become permanent simply because no one returns. A less obvious part of this story is that ancestry can disappear without everyone dying at once. Imagine a small group merging into a much larger neighbouring population. Their children survive. Their grandchildren survive. But over many generations, some distinctive genetic markers become rare. Other lineages expand more successfully. Chance plays a role. So does population size. So does who has children and how communities mix. Genetic disappearance is not always physical disappearance. That distinction is important. A group can vanish as a recognizable population while its people continue living within another community. You pause on the ridge. Wind moves across the grass. For a moment, you picture two camps becoming one. Perhaps drought has reduced water in the region. Perhaps one community has lost several members. Perhaps partnerships already connect the groups. They begin sharing a campsite. Children grow up with relatives from both sides. Old differences fade, a generation later. No one thinks of the union as unusual. What does archaeology see? Archaeology see maybe nothing clear, the stone tools may look similar, the fires leave the same ash, the bones do not preserve. A profound social transformation can happen without leaving a neat layer in the ground. There are several possible explanations for why some early expansions beyond Africa left limited ancestry in later populations. Some groups may have died out locally. Some may have retreated when climates worsened. Some may have been absorbed by later populations. Others may have contributed ancestry that became extremely difficult to detect after tens of thousands of years. The record does not choose a single explanation for every region, and that uncertainty makes the landscape feel larger, not smaller. You descend toward open country. The sun is high now. Heat shimmers above the ground. Someone carries water wrapped in a container that will never fossilize. Someone else holds a stone point that might survive for 100,000 years. It is strange to think that the object may outlive the lineage of the person carrying it. Archaeology can preserve tools after identities disappear. A stone tradition can continue even when populations merge. A useful technique may spread farther than ancestry, so culture and genes do not always travel together. This is one of the more interesting complications in reconstructing early human movement. A new tool style does not automatically mean a new population arrived. People can learn from neighbours. Ideas move, objects move, partners move. Sometimes all three move together. Sometimes they do not. Modern borders encourage you to imagine populations as solid blocks of colour on a map. Prehistoric people probably looked much less tidy. Their communities overlapped. Their networks stretched across uncertain distances. Their identities may have changed through marriage, movement, and environment. Some branches of humanity became broad rivers. Others remained small streams. A few sank underground. You stop beside another ancient campsite late in the afternoon. There is nothing visible now except stone and soil. No shelter remains. No voices. No smoke. Yet imagine a family sitting here 90,000 years ago. Someone is telling a story. Someone is annoyed at a child. Someone is making a tool badly and pretending otherwise. Someone is thinking about a person in another camp. That entire social world can disappear from the future while still having been complete in its own time. This is why the word lost can be misleading. Lost to whom? Not to the people who lived it. Their lives were present. Only our access to them is lost. The light softens. Your group prepares another small fire. Smoke curls upward and bends in the breeze. You think again about the branches that left few descendants. There is something calming in the idea that history does not preserve everything equally. Not every life needs to become part of a dominant lineage to have mattered. Not every journey needs to lead to a modern population to have been real. People moved, they settled, they adapted. They loved people whose names are gone, they taught skills that may have outlived them. And then the great tree of humanity kept growing in other directions. You sit closer to the fire as darkness gathers. The forgotten branches are still there in the shape of the tree, even when you can no longer see where everyone began. The fire from the night before has almost disappeared when you wake. Only a faint red glow remains beneath the ash. You sit for a while without moving around you. The camp is still quiet, a few people are already awake, but no one is in a hurry. Morning comes slowly here, and the work of the day begins in small movements. A hand reaches for a tool, a bundle is opened, a child rolls onto one side and pulls closer to the warmth. You think about the journeys behind you, the caves, the lakes, the green corridors, the groups that met, the groups that vanished, the branches of humanity that continued and the branches that faded. And now another question begins to rise. When did people become truly modern? It sounds simple. It is not. For many years, older interpretations suggested that something dramatic happened later in prehistory. Perhaps around 40 or 50,000 years ago, suddenly, according to that older picture, art flourished, ornaments appeared, tools became more varied, and symbolic behaviour seemed to brighten all at once. It was often described almost like a cultural awakening, a revolution. But the farther back archaeologists look, especially in Africa, the less comfortable that idea becomes. You have already seen why. Ochre appears earlier, shell ornaments appear earlier, complex stoneworking appears earlier, careful burials appear earlier, long-distance movement appears earlier. Human behaviour does not seem to wait patiently for one grand moment of invention. Instead, it appears in pieces. You leave camp and walk toward a low rock shelter where people have worked before. The ground is littered with stone flakes. Some are ordinary, others show careful preparation. One toolmaker sits near the entrance. Turning a piece of stone in the morning light, they strike it, pause, turn it again. Another flake comes away. The rhythm is familiar now, but beside them, someone is doing something different. A small piece of ochre is being ground against stone. Nearby lies a shell, further back. A wooden object is being shaped with a sharp edge. Nothing in the shelter looks revolutionary, and that is precisely the point. Human innovation may often have looked like this. One person trying something, another copying it, a technique working well for a while, then perhaps disappearing. Later, something similar appears somewhere else. The archaeological record from Africa between roughly 300,000 and 50,000 years ago increasingly shows this kind of uneven pattern. New behaviours do not arrive everywhere at the same time. They appear in different places, in different combinations, and sometimes vanish from the record for thousands of years. At one site, pigments may be common; at another, ornaments; elsewhere, elaborate stone technologies. Some communities seem to experiment. Others continue using methods that already work. The result is not a staircase. It is a mosaic. You walk deeper into the shelter. Light from the entrance falls across the floor in a broad, pale strip. Beyond it, shadows gather. Someone has scratched lines into a surface. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. This is where the evidence becomes delicate. A few engraved objects from African sites are much later than 90,000 years ago, but still ancient enough to challenge the idea that symbolic behaviour suddenly appeared only in Europe. Blombos Cave, for example, has produced engraved ochre pieces and shell beads from tens of thousands of years before the famous cave paintings of Upper Paleolithic Europe. Other sites preserve evidence of pigment processing, specialised tools, and repeated occupation. Each discovery adds another small light, and together, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. You sit beside the wall, the stone is cool. Outside, you hear birds calling from dry brush. Inside, Someone tests the edge of a newly made point. There is no cheering. No one announces that humanity has entered a new intellectual age. The tool is simply useful. That quietness matters. Innovation rarely feels historic while it is happening. Today, a new household object can seem ordinary within a few years. A technology arrives. People complain about it, someone learns it quickly, someone refuses to use it, then, eventually, no one remembers life without it. Prehistoric change may have felt equally uneven. Some ideas spread, some do not. Some require materials that are rare, some depend on social networks. Some may disappear when populations shrink or become isolated. This leads to one of the hardest questions in human evolution. Is innovation mainly about intelligence or population or connection or environment? There is no settled answer. One possibility is that larger, more connected populations are better able to preserve complex skills. If one person invents something useful, the idea has more chances to spread. Another possibility is that difficult or changing environments encourage experimentation. A third is that symbolic behavior was already widespread but often made from materials that decay. All may be partly true. You look around the shelter again. How much has vanished? Wooden decorations, painted skin, feather ornaments, woven patterns, songs, dance, stories, body painting, hairstyles. None of these need to survive. Stone survives because stone is stubborn. So archaeology may give you a world in which human creativity looks unusually rocky. That imbalance is easy to forget. An especially strange consequence is that a society could be visually rich and leave almost no visual trace. Imagine clothing decorated with fibers and pigment. Imagine hair braided in recognizable styles. Imagine faces painted for meetings. Imagine wooden objects carved with patterns. If all of it decays, the future may find only a few flakes and conclude that life was plain. The silence of the evidence can make the past look simpler than it was. Outside, the day grows warmer. A child imitates the ochre grinding, red powder touches their fingers, an adult wipes some away. Then the child tries again. Perhaps that is how traditions begin, not with explanation, with copying, watching, repeating. You follow the group later as they move towards another camp. Some tools travel with them, so does the ochre, so do habits. Particular method of shaping stone can cross a valley because one person marries into another group. A decorative practice can travel because visitors are admired. A new technique can disappear because the only person who knows it dies before teaching anyone else. Innovation is fragile, but it is also persistent. Ideas vanish, then similar ideas return. This irregular pattern has led many researchers away from the old search for a single moment when modern behavior began. The question itself may be too simple. There may never have been one morning when humans suddenly became mentally modern. There may have been thousands of mornings like this one. Someone refining a tool, someone carrying pigment, someone wearing a shell, someone teaching a child, someone remembering what worked last season. The afternoon light softens as you reach the next camp. People look up, objects are placed down, food is shared. A visitor notices the red pigment. Someone examines the stone point. Perhaps a question is asked. Perhaps an idea begins to move. You watch the exchange without knowing which detail, if any, will matter later. That is another comforting truth about history. Most change is invisible while it happens. It does not arrive with thunder. It passes quietly from hand to hand. And as evening settles over the camp, you begin to see human modernity not as a sudden flame, but as countless small sparks appearing across different landscapes, fading, returning, and slowly becoming harder to extinguish. The sparks from the evening fire linger in your mind as the journey continues. You have watched ideas move quietly from one camp to another. You have seen how people carry more than tools. They carry habits, memories, ways of teaching, and knowledge of places beyond the horizon. Now the world begins to shift again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but over thousands of years. The human story starts preparing for another expansion. You walk across a broad plain in the early morning. The air is cool enough to feel pleasant against your face. Grass bends under a light wind. Somewhere ahead, a herd moves toward the lower ground, and a line of birds follows the edge of a distant wetland. The people around you are already skilled travelers. They know how to move through different environments. They can live near coasts, rivers, grasslands, forests, and dry interiors. They can work stone from different sources. They can change what they eat when conditions change. They can maintain relationships with people who live far beyond the immediate camp. None of these abilities is entirely new. What matters is the way they begin to combine. As generations pass, some human populations become increasingly capable of surviving across a wider range of habitats. That flexibility will matter enormously in the tens of thousands of years ahead, when Homo sapiens spreads across much of Eurasia and eventually reaches lands far beyond anything visible from this plane. You follow a group toward a rocky ridge. They are carrying food, water, tools, and materials for repairing equipment. One person has a bundle of stone pieces gathered from a source you passed days earlier. Another carries something made from plant fiber. A child walks between two adults, occasionally stopping to inspect the ground. The movement feels practiced. No one seems surprised by the idea of leaving one familiar place and traveling toward another. Mobility itself is a skill. It requires knowing how much to carry, where to stop, how far children and older people can travel, where water may be found, what route is safe after rain, which neighbouring groups might offer help. A migration is not simply walking, it is logistics without written lists. You reach the ridge and look back. The camp from yesterday is already invisible. That disappearance feels important. Humans can carry their social world with them. A home does not need permanent walls. It can be rebuilt around another fire, another shelter, another water source. The ability to recreate familiar routines in unfamiliar places may have been one of the quiet strengths of Homo sapiens. Food is shared again. Tools are repaired again. Children learn again. Stories are told again. The landscape changes, but the social structure travels. Evidence from later prehistoric sites across Africa and Southwest Asia shows that human populations continue to diversify their technologies and ways of using local environments. By the period after 90,000 years ago, some groups appear increasingly comfortable exploiting coastlines, dry regions, and other ecological zones that older stereotypes once portrayed as marginal. This does not mean every group could live anywhere. Conditions still impose limits. But the range of possible human habitats was growing. You descend toward a dry valley. At first, there seems to be little water. The ground is pale, shrubs cast narrow shadows, then one of the adults changes direction. They walk toward a depression between rocks. There, beneath an overhang, moisture is collected. Not much. Enough. The group drinks carefully. You realize that knowledge can make an environment appear richer than it looks. To a stranger, this valley may seem empty. To someone who knows where water hides, when certain plants appear and which route leads to shade, it is usable country. That kind of knowledge makes expansion possible without requiring landscapes to become easy. A small but revealing feature of prehistoric travel is the movement of raw materials over distance. Stone found far from its geological origin suggests that people sometimes carried useful material across broad territories or obtained it through contacts with others. The object may be small, its journey may be large. A flake a few centimetres long can therefore hint at a social geography extending far beyond the excavation site where it is eventually found. You pick up one imagined piece, smooth on one side, sharp on another. It has travelled farther than you know, perhaps through one person's hands, perhaps through 5. That uncertainty is part of the story. There is no universal agreement on exactly which factors best explain the latest successful expansion of Homo sapiens beyond Africa. Some interpretations emphasize climate windows. Others focus on demographic growth, social networks, technological flexibility, or the ability to exploit a broad range of foods and environments. The answer is probably not one thing. Success rarely comes from one thing. A population can have good tools and still fail if water disappears. It can have favourable climate and still remain small. It can have strong social networks and still suffer bad luck. The later expansion of humans likely emerged from combinations that differed from region to region. You continue walking. By afternoon, clouds build over distant hills. The smell of rain reaches you before the rain itself. People look upward. A few drops darken the dust. Then the shower arrives. Not heavy, just enough to cool the air. Children lift their faces. Adults pull materials closer to keep them dry. Water gathers briefly in shallow footprints. There is something almost symbolic about the moment, though the people beside you would probably find that idea unnecessarily poetic. To them, rain is useful, that is enough. Still, the landscape seems to open. Wet ground means plants, plants mean animals, animals mean movement, movement means opportunity. The next generations will inherit not only genes, but roots. They will inherit the memory that a valley beyond these hills sometimes holds water. They will inherit techniques for shaping tools. They will inherit relationships with distant communities. They will inherit ways of reading unfamiliar country. This inherited flexibility is easy to overlook because it leaves no single monument. There is no first road, no first expedition, no plaque marking where global dispersal begins. Instead, readiness accumulates. One route learned, one food source added, one social connection maintained, one successful crossing remembered, one child taught how to find water in dry ground. You climb another rise as evening approaches. From here, the world looks endless. No one around you knows that human descendants will eventually live in frozen northern landscapes. Tropical forests, high mountains, islands, deserts, and distant continents separated by enormous bodies of water. They are not preparing consciously for that future. They are preparing for tomorrow. And that is enough. History often works this way. Large transformations are built from actions that feel small to the people performing them. A family chooses a new camp, a group follows a river, someone learns to gather food from an unfamiliar shore. A traveller remembers a route and teaches it years later. Slowly, the range of human possibility widens. The rain stops, the clouds thin, warm light returns near the horizon. Smoke from a newly made fire begins to rise. You sit beside it and look toward the country ahead. Soon, later populations will move outward in ways that leave a much stronger genetic and archaeological legacy. But the ground beneath that expansion is already being prepared, not by conquerors, by adaptable people, people who know how to move, how to connect, how to learn, how to begin again when the landscape changes. The fire settles into a steady glow. Beyond it, the road is invisible, but humanity is becoming very good at finding roads where none appear to exist. The last fire of your journey burns quietly beneath a darkening sky. You sit beside it and look back over the immense distance you have travelled, not in miles, in time. You have walked through Africa when its climates shifted between greener and drier phases. You have watched people gather roots, shape stone, teach children, bury the dead, decorate themselves with shells and pigment, follow lakes into Arabia, and move through regions already inhabited by other kinds of humans. And now, after all of that, you return to the question that began this journey. What really happened to humans 90,000 years ago? The answer is quieter than the title of a mystery might suggest. There was no single night when humanity nearly vanished. No one disaster explains everything. No sudden moment transformed ordinary humans into modern ones. Instead, you find populations moving through a changing world. Some communities became isolated, others reconnected. Some travelled beyond Africa and left only faint traces in later ancestry. Others remained in regions where their descendants continued adapting for thousands of years. Some encountered Neanderthals or other human populations. Some carried new ideas across social networks. Some disappeared as distinct groups while fragments of their ancestry, culture, or technology continued elsewhere. Humanity around 90,000 years ago was not standing still. It was branching. You watch sparks rise from the fire. Each one glows briefly, travels upward, and disappears. The image resembles the population history you have followed. Some human lineages expand, some fade, some merge with others, and a few leave traces that survive long enough for scientists in a distant future to recognize them. Genetic research has transformed this story because living people carry records that stone tools cannot preserve. Human genomes reveal ancient population splits, periods of mixing, expansions, contractions, and encounters with other human groups. Yet genetics is not a complete diary. It cannot tell you what someone said beside a fire. It cannot preserve a lullaby. It cannot tell you whether two strangers meeting beside an Arabian lake became friends. Archaeology fills some of those spaces. A shell bead tells you someone cared about appearance or identity. Ochre tells you people selected and processed colour. A prepared stone core reveals planning. A burial suggests attention toward the dead. A fossil finger from an ancient Arabian lake proves that a person reached a landscape once considered too distant or difficult for such an early journey. None of these discoveries alone explains humanity. Together, they create a pattern, and the pattern is adaptability. You rise and walk away from the fire for a moment. The night air is cool, grass brushes against your legs, somewhere beyond the camp. An animal moves through darkness with a low rustling sound. Above you, the stars are almost painfully bright. The people around you know many of those stars. Perhaps they use certain patterns to mark seasons. Perhaps stories are attached to them. Perhaps they simply look upward, as people always have, and wonder what lies beyond what they can see. We cannot recover those thoughts. That limitation is important. One of the strangest things about deep history is that the surviving evidence becomes more precise in some ways while remaining completely silent in others. Scientists may date a layer of sediment, they may identify the chemical composition of pigment, they may extract ancient DNA from a fragment of bone. And yet the name of the person who held that bone remains impossible to know. The ancient world offers measurements without introductions. You return to the fire. A child is asleep nearby. An older person rearranges a piece of wood with a stick. Someone is repairing a binding around a tool. No one here knows that their era will one day be called prehistoric. For them, nothing is before history. Everything is now. This is perhaps the most useful thought to carry from the journey. People living 90,000 years ago did not experience themselves as primitive. They did not wake each morning waiting for civilization to arrive. Their world was complete. It contained obligations, fears, comfort, food, weather, relationships, memory, and probably far more humour than archaeology can ever prove. The archaeological record still leaves important questions unresolved. Exactly how many early expansions occurred beyond Africa remains uncertain. The contribution of some of those populations to later humans is still being refined. The routes they followed shift as new sites are discovered and dating improves. Researchers continue testing how climate, population size, social connection, and technology interacted. There may never be one neat model that explains every region. Perhaps there should not be. Human history is usually complicated because humans are complicated. A wetter climate can open a route. But people still choose whether to move. A new technique can appear, but someone must teach it. Two populations can meet and respond in many different ways. One group may adapt successfully to a changing landscape while another nearby struggles. Chance remains part of the story too. A storm, an illness, a failed season, a fortunate discovery of water. History is shaped by enormous forces and tiny accidents at the same time. You notice the fire beginning to sink. The wood has burned into red sections surrounded by grey ash. The camp is becoming still, soon. The later human expansions will begin to leave stronger traces across Eurasia. Much later, people will reach Australia, later still. Humans will spread into the Americas, villages will appear, agriculture will change daily life. Cities will rise, writing will preserve names. Kings will build monuments and insist that everyone remember them. But none of that exists yet. Here, history is carried in bodies and minds, a route remembered by an elder, a method copied by a child, a shell worn around a neck, a story repeated beside a fire. The foundations of everything that follows are almost invisible. And perhaps that is what really happened around 90,000 years ago. Humanity did not suddenly become something new. It kept becoming slowly, unevenly, across many landscapes at once. Some branches ended, others continued. Connections formed and broke apart, knowledge travelled. People survived difficult climates not through one miraculous invention, but through flexibility, cooperation, memory, and an extraordinary ability to learn from changing circumstances. The answer to the mystery is not a catastrophe, it is persistence. You look once more across the sleeping camp. The small fire sends one final spark upward. For a moment it glows against the stars, then it vanishes into the night, and the human story continues beneath it. The night around you is very quiet now. The ancient landscape has lost most of its detail, softened by darkness until the distant hills are only gentle shapes beneath the stars. You no longer need to follow anyone. The travellers can continue without you. Some will wake before sunrise and search for water. Some will repair tools beside another fire. Children will grow older. Elders will repeat familiar routes. A shell may pass from one person to another. A story may survive for generations and then quietly disappear. The fire beside you becomes smaller. Red light settles beneath the ash. The voices around the camp fade until only the soft movement of wind remains. You have travelled through 90,000 years of distance without needing to hurry, and now there is nowhere else you need to go tonight. The questions can remain unanswered. The forgotten names can remain forgotten. The ancient roads can disappear gently beneath sand, water, grass, and time. You can simply rest with the knowledge that people were here. They walked beneath stars much like these. They felt cold night air against their skin. They found warmth beside other people. They watched darkness settle across landscapes they knew by heart. Slowly, even the fire loses its shape. The last glow becomes dimmer. The hills fade. The stars seem farther away. And the enormous prehistoric world you have been walking through begins to soften at its edges, as though the night itself is gently closing around it. Nothing dramatic waits beyond the darkness. Only another morning, far away, for now. The camp is safe. The fire is warm enough, the journey is finished, and you can let the ancient world drift quietly from view. Sweet dreams.